So without further ado, we're going to get into our keynote speaker. As Barry said, he's got a very provocative title. The next disruptor of clinical trials is not coming from Silicon Valley. Please help me welcome Craig Lipset, our keynote speaker for day 2. Craig is an advisor, educator, advocate, and innovator focused on novel solutions for clinical trials and medicine development. He is the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners, providing advisory and board leadership with pharma, tech, and investors. Craig is co-chair for the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, chair of the MedStar Health Research Institute, and vice president of the Foundation for Sarcoidosis. He is adjunctive assistant professor in health informatics, also at Rutgers University. Craig was previously the head of clinical innovation and venture partners at Pfizer and on the founding management teams for 2 successful startups. I will also note that Craig describes himself the following way on Twitter. He's a guy. He describes himself as a guy and his dogs modernizing clinical trials to serve patients. I've gone through much of his work. It's very impressive, and we're the beneficiaries of this work today. Craig's topic is the next disruptor of clinical trials is not coming from Silicon Valley. A very provocative headline. Thank you for being with us today, Craig.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I am truly honored and really looking forward to spending this time together with this community. I have to acknowledge that the theme of a patient-centered approach to clinical trials is very topical right now. It's very timely. And the fact that this meeting has been taking place for as many years that it has been is truly remarkable and very impressive. And so, again, it is my pleasure to be here with this community and to share some perspectives on where the next disruption in clinical trials is going to come from, with this bit of a hint that it's not where so many stakeholders may be assuming or looking at today. Well, as was mentioned, I have a number of affiliations, both past and present, both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, but the perspectives, the views I will be sharing are not necessarily representative of those organizations. These will be just my views today, but often based on the aggregate of a lot of the insights I get to gather from working across all these different stakeholders and organizations. Well, let's jump in. It's always interesting to see that word disruption in a presentation title, so I thought it would make sense to begin with a definition. And the definition that I'm going to use here today really focuses on disruption in business. This is a definition from Jean-Marie Drew. The definition here, disruption is a process of breaking conventions to accelerate movement to the future. So what we're breaking are sort of the norms and the assumptions. And it's interesting to hear disruption defined as a process. It's not just a moment or an event. Okay, so for our time together, there are 3 themes that we're going to speak through. First, we're going to begin just with a little bit of level setting. What are some of those key trends in the environment today? Then we're going to focus on some of the opportunities for innovation in clinical trials that we're seeing and focusing on today. And then we'll use that to leap forward and start to share some considerations for who is going to be in the driver's seat, leading us to that future. But let's begin this conversation by talking about where we are and our trends in the environment today. Well, there is no shortage of interesting signals and headlines that many of us see in both the lay and the trade media, whether it's about the large technology companies that are increasingly entering this space, big tech companies from Amazon and Microsoft and Google, Verily, all taking interest in clinical researches and life sciences? Are they coming in to be an ally to the incumbents? Are they entering this to bring the type of disruption that they've brought to so many other segments and verticals? The signals around the use of sensors, wearables, and connected devices in clinical research today. How might we make better use of these technologies to improve how we're measuring in our clinical research studies? Measuring to understand who may be eligible to participate in a trial, measuring to understand the efficacy of those new medicines by modernizing our endpoints. Measurement in order to improve how we're capturing and understanding safety data associated with a new medicine. We also see these important signals today around the challenge of representation and inclusion, the lack of diversity in our research studies. And in recent years, that volume has increased more than ever and has brought a wave of initiatives and investments, the likes of which we really haven't seen in years past, despite being very aware of that lack of representation. And much of that has brought along some significant interest and attention from the regulatory community, with guidance and recommendations coming out from the FDA, but also pieces of policy in the United States hinting and suggesting that there could be incentives and penalties associated with inclusion and representation or lack thereof. There's certainly a tremendous amount of buzz today around these keywords like patient centricity in clinical trials. I think that this forum has been meeting since before those words became quite as prevalent in the media as we see it today. But today it's become so widespread. There's such a vague almost use of these terms that it causes many to wonder, what does this even mean today? Are some stakeholders overusing what may be patient-centric and what may just be a simple extension of what they've been doing for years? And then, of course, coming out of the pandemic is this interesting curiosity about how do we bring that warp speed pace and energy and innovation into all of our development programs? How do we bring that sense of urgency that drove such breakthroughs at an aggressive pace to medicines for other patient populations in need? And how do we do that without breaking the system? Since so much of Warp Speed was really powered by human capital, human resource, and just putting people on the problem at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a clearly unsustainable model. But if I had to pick two signals, I would lean in on these two. There's this focus and attention today around data science and technology. How do I harness and leverage diverse data? How do I take advantage of the latest and most meaningful technologies to improve how I'm capturing and understanding data? And this attention around patient centricity and inclusion. Is the work that I'm doing meaningful to patients, the investments I'm making meaningful for the participants who will be involved? And how am I making investments to ensure that all who could be able to participate are able to participate? Well, let's talk a bit about how research sponsors on the biopharma side are responding to so many of those signals in the environment in terms of the types of areas where investment and innovation is taking place. Today, I would argue that just about all of your mid-size and large biopharmaceutical companies have initiatives in either close to all of 5 of these areas or in all of the areas that you see on the screen today. On the far left, thinking about how to bring more real-world data into our prospective research programs, not just as an alternative to a conventional clinical trial, but how can bringing electronic health record data into our studies help accelerate and complement the prospective studies that we're running? The reason, by the way, why you'll hear me say that real-world data does not replace a clinical trial is many of us are studying investigational medicines for which there is no real world data. They're not approved and commercialized and on the market yet. And so there'll always have to be this connection between the two. We spoke a moment ago about the range of investments and efforts taking place today to drive better diversity and inclusion. How do we help earn trust where it's been lost for so many years? And are we really prepared to make the long-term commitments required to earn that trust, to drive meaningful change and participation? Certainly, during the COVID vaccine trials in many countries, some true milestones were achieved in terms of representation. How do we continue to amplify that great work, but do it in a more sustaining way? There have been some important investments the research community has been making to better design studies up front through the use of data and technology. How can we harness and leverage diverse insights driven from data, electronic health records, and epidemiologic data, and past performance, and other sources of intelligence, all coming together to help to make a study design right the first time? The typical model of launching a study and then pausing it to drive protocol amendments and changes is expensive, and it slows the process. And quite honestly, it's not a fair process for those patients who chose to participate early in that program. And so better to use data and design those studies right the first time, and it's become an important area of innovation and investment for so many. And as we hinted at earlier, that proliferation of enthusiasm around sensors and wearables, how do we modernize our endpoints through the use of digital and start to capture measurements in a more meaningful way rather than typical old endpoints that we've relied on for years? I think a classic example in this lane for so many is to think about something we call the 6-minute walk test. It's been an endpoint used for studies from movement disorder to heart failure for decades, involving patients coming into the clinic, site staff marking some distance in the hallway of around 20 meters, maybe with tape on the floor or putting down a cone, and watching the patient walk for 6 minutes back and forth in that circle. And we know we can capture the same or better data today using maybe a connected device on the wrist or your own phone in your pocket. But doing so requires an investment of time and energy, and it's these types of initiatives and investments that will drive that type of change. And then last, at the top of the screen, around decentralizing our trials and helping to make them more accessible. And I'm going to double click on that one in just a moment. But first, this slide is showing some data we were able to collect from initially about 10 pharma companies. We collected this just in the last few weeks, starting to look at what are those areas that organizations are advancing and utilizing today in their portfolios in terms of digital and innovation. And as we can see, heavy focus today on data capture and how we can capture data in better and smarter ways, using that data in terms of study design, site selection, feasibility, but maybe still a bit light when it comes to improving experience for research participants, improving the screening and consent process for patients who may be considering research participation. Now, one area in particular that has seen some remarkable adoption over the course of the pandemic has been this theme of enabling participation in a clinical trial from home. Certainly during the pandemic, we had that experience of everything shifting to our homes, from our work to how our kids are being educated to how groceries are being delivered. And the same was true for clinical trials and shifting participation in a way that we frequently today refer to as decentralizing those studies. But like so many things that we adopted during the pandemic, this approach of enabling remote participation was hardly new. This is a press release dating back to 2011 for some work that I helped to design and lead during my time at Pfizer around the first fully virtual or fully online clinical trial under an FDA IND. And that led just a few years later to some great work by the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, a public-private partnership with the FDA that released recommendations in 2018, well in advance of the pandemic. In fact, in January of 2020, before the lockdowns associated with COVID-19, this was a slide I had presented at a meeting showing the 17-year history of decentralization in clinical trials. But the theme for that slide at the time was about there being an oversupply in the market. By the way, if you're squinting to try to see that on screen, I actually just pinned that that slide on my Twitter account. So if you are on Twitter, you can click on me, Craig Lipset, and you can see that slide a lot larger and hopefully with a lot more resolution. But the key theme here has been that COVID-19 didn't drive innovation. It didn't spark us necessarily creating radical new approaches. In these cases, like so many others, it just drove the adoption of smarter ways of doing business that we had always hoped we'd be able to implement, but struggled to drive change. But that's not today where the story of decentralization is ending. That's really just the beginning. Because like so many changes that were made out of necessity during the pandemic, these changes are being normalized. They're being stabilized in most organizations. And so what we're seeing is more and more research sponsors and research sites embedding these decentralized approaches as just new tools in their clinical trial toolbox, using video for remote visits, home health and visiting nurses where appropriate, enabling investigational medicine to be delivered to patients in the home, all of these and so many more. But again, that's just the beginning of this journey. Like so many changes implemented during the pandemic, they were implemented with great urgency, but they may not be our final state. And so today, we see so many studies that are now thinking well beyond the home, starting to experiment with mobile research units or how research visits could take place inside of retail locations like your local pharmacy, or maybe it's your local Walmart, or even how those study visits could take place in the trusted and familiar environment of your community physician's office, your local doctor down the street. The real desired end state for so many in clinical research as it relates to this story of at home and decentralized isn't so much to enable all visits to take place in the home. It's really about how do we create choice and flexibility. If you're my age or older, this may be a story like those choose your own adventure books we were used to as a child. But for so many of us, we're seeing this type of flexibility in so many of the tools and applications we're interacting with on a regular basis. And while these might be small on your screen, one example is just food ordering today from a mobile app and how frequently we're seeing choices in that process. Would you like it brought to your table, picked up, pull up in your car, or delivered to your house? We see it with retail as well. And so what we're starting to see more and more for our research studies is how can we look on a visit by visit basis in the protocol and start to give patients choice on a visit by visit basis. For visit one, does it all have to be in the clinic, or can we enable options for that visit, such as home or video or a visiting nurse or coming to the clinic, because that just feels safer and more familiar to the patient. So I want to reinforce here that shifting location for trials is about patient preference going forward. It's not the end of the investigator side as we know it today, because patients actually overwhelmingly like their experience at investigator sites. Their challenge is not that they don't like research sites and want them to vanish. Their challenge is they can't always get there and sometimes need more flexible and accommodating options for a visit. Okay, we've talked a bit about some trends in the environment, and we've talked a bit about some of the opportunities where pharma and other research sponsors are making investments today. The next question for us to explore then is, if these are some of the futures that we see on the horizon, who's going to be leading this change? And so one food for thought is we increasingly hear this story about patients being invited to have a seat at the table. And certainly that sounds promising, certainly relative to where patients may have felt they've been for so many years, operating as outsiders or adjacent to the process. But having a seat at the table today may lead to some interesting follow-on questions. And this certainly is meant to be an image that can invoke some different sentiment around what type of table are you being placed at? Which table are you being seated at? Is it at the grown-up table or is it at the kids' table? And are all the chairs at that table equal? Are they all permanent chairs at the table, or is some a folding bridge chair that's brought in periodically and then removed after certain courses are being served? But I think the real fundamental question for so many of us as we're thinking about having a seat at the table is the question of whose table is it anyway? If we're assuming that a pharma company or some other stakeholder is the one who's passing out the invitations to join the table, there's always going to be an imbalance in the relationship. Or is the table truly meant to be equitable, where everybody has shared representation and shared participation? Or is there a different stakeholder who is meant to and has the right to own that table going forward? So let's talk about a few clues that can lead us down thinking for who might own that table and be in the right position to be inviting others to the table going forward. Because we shouldn't assume that everybody as we know it today in the ecosystem has a right to be there. If we think about the stakeholders involved in clinical research today, I would argue that if you are a current stakeholder in clinical research, but in the future models you are not adding value, then you need to accept your obsolescence and move on, because those that are here have a sense of urgency for action and change. And if you are not adding value, you're probably inhibiting or slowing progress. And so if we think about the current stakeholders in clinical research today, regulators, CROs, sites, pharma, patients, there are potential futures out there where any stakeholder could be obsolete. Obsolescence isn't necessarily always a bad thing. When we think about regulation, certainly in countries like the United States, shifting political winds are constantly blowing back and forth between regulation and deregulation. Increasingly, we see opportunities through initiatives like ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization, to try to find ways to normalize regulatory thinking and processes on a global basis. And so a second scenario might be, as regulatory thinking becomes increasingly globalized, what is the role for local regulators when so much becomes global in nature? And then finally, as we think about regulatory pathways as we've known them for years, there are shifts to enable more stepwise approvals of medicines, that perhaps we can generate approvals based on very small populations and just use ongoing data captured through small populations to incrementally expand labels. And what might that mean for the future of regulators in this process? If you're not familiar, CROs are contract research organizations, clinical research organizations. They're companies, either domestic or multinational, that today are critical as the arms and legs and sometimes enablers of research oversight and conduct. Many pharma companies don't employ all the people around the world that are needed to provide oversight and monitoring and other functions. But as we see more and more use of digital and technology, how will that drive more automation in the process? Automating how we're capturing data, automating some of the quality and oversight of that data. And in doing so, might that start to eliminate some of the role that CROs have typically played in the process? Are there futures where that role of a CRO has shifted so much that the CRO as we know it is actually displaced with technology and rendered obsolete in its current form? Now, there are some that in the past have noted that there could be an obsolescence of research sites as we know it today. If we see futures where there's more and more centralization of research oversight, are there futures where, say, large academic centers are providing most of the oversight for research studies, leveraging video and other distributed approaches, enabling participation in your community physician's office? And so might there be futures where the a large, wide-scale infrastructure of sites as we know it today might look very different, with a very small number of concentrated research sites providing oversight over physicians in the community, making research more accessible. Interestingly, there are futures where pharma themselves might be obsolete as we know it today. Again, assuming that a pharma company will always have that right to be the one inviting others to the table may not be the case for all the futures that might exist out there, especially as we see approaches that democratize funding, democratize data flow, democratize study processes and technologies. Is there less of a dependence relying on the central funding role when all of these tools and processes can be much more widely available? We're going to share a few more thoughts on that in just a moment. Interestingly, the one stakeholder in this whole process who might actually embrace obsolescence are the research participants themselves, because most patients do not aspire to be in a clinical research study. They're struggling for access to new treatment options. And so if there are futures out there that can make better use of synthetic data, reusing real world data, creating digital twins of myself using artificial intelligence and other modeling driven approaches, if there are futures out there that could enable a digital twin of me to be a participant in a study, to virtually assess whether a new medicine works or not, I'm not sure that many patients would object to that, especially if the outcome is fewer patients exposed to a placebo or control arm and faster access to an evidence-driven new medicine being commercially available and on the market. Now, the way I'd love to pull together a lot of this conversation is this question of who has the right to lead these futures. And as we hinted at earlier, very often the person inviting others to the table are those that have control and access to the funding needed to master medicine development, that have access to the ability to aggregate and gather data and evidence, and that have the right motivation and sense of urgency. And so historically, that has been large pharmaceutical companies. And when we think about disruptors in this space, I think it's all too easy for many to point to Silicon Valley, because let's face it, leading technology companies have been an incredible disruptive force for so many other verticals. When we think about supermarket shopping and buying books to how we drive our cars on the road today, these technologies have been incredibly disruptive, but are they the ones that have all of the right ingredients to be the leaders of this process going forward? The way I'd like us to think about this last question is to think about medicine development and clinical research, like so many things, is really just a set of processes, right? We have to be able to access the funding that's needed because it's non-trivial. There's a need for basic research in terms of identifying targets and potential new molecules to develop. We have to be able to access cohorts of people, patient populations who can help us to evaluate if these new medicines work or if they don't. There are discrete processes involved in the clinical trial, from study design and feasibility, straight through to how we go about collecting our data to understand the efficacy and safety of that medicine. And then finally, all of this culminates with some sort of engagement today with regulatory authorities in terms of presenting data and evidence to make a case around the efficacy and safety of that new medicine. Now, today, this process is owned by integrated biopharmaceutical companies. They've become masters of this process, and they've become increasingly better at bringing different stakeholders to that table. But the question that I would ask is, going forward, will it always be biopharma inviting stakeholders, such as patients, to the table, or are there futures where that gets flipped around? Are there futures where organized patients step forward to own and control all the steps in this process? Because as we'll talk about over the next few minutes, there are examples of organized patients owning every step in the process that we just described. And just as a biopharma company has become very good at serving an integrated function across all these needs, might there be futures where organized patients themselves are the ones integrating across all of these? Maybe they're the ones inviting pharma to their table going forward to provide the incremental support that pharma may be able to, whether it's around manufacturing or other expertise in a process that's actually owned and controlled by organized patients themselves. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, one example would be around the funding for drug development. And again, a non-trivial process. But we have seen models emerging in recent years where patients have demonstrated the ability to organize through models like crowdfunding or other approaches. We've seen the cystic fibrosis community through the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation be able to invest in biotechnology companies like Aurora Biosciences and later Vertex Pharmaceuticals, bringing important new breakthroughs back to the CF community, but breakthroughs that were all catalyzed by the funding driven by the patient organization, by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. We've seen other spaces where crowdfunding campaigns have proven to be meaningful in terms of patients organizing to generate the capital needed for this very expensive process and be able to get potential medicines out of the freezer and into the clinic. Platforms like iCancer in Europe that helped to bring a cancer vaccine program out of the freezer in Uppsala and into clinical trials. And we've seen some other very provocative proposals. One that we can certainly talk a bit about, but I can also point you to some resources online, like what the author, Alexander Masters, has called a plutocratic proposal. The idea that some development programs perhaps could be funded by affected high net worth individuals who could fund a development program in exchange for a seat in that clinical trial. And while that might prove ethically questionable for some, it is a very provocative proposal to consider. If there is a clinical trial that might enroll 30 or 50 people, that is not going to happen for lack of funding. If there is a wealthy individual who is able to fund that entire program in exchange for one of those seats in the trial, that then serves to benefit 49 other patients as well as all the patients that might follow. And so it is a provocative question. I'm not going to say there's an answer definitively one way or the other, but there have been some interesting pieces written by the Wellcome Trust and others challenging some of the assumptions about that may just be flawed out of the gate and why there may be some merit to consider. And then certainly some that are taking this approach of looking at blockchain and other models for how ownership and equity in the return of that medicine might also be more distributed. Again, without necessarily expecting that there is a pharmaceutical company always involved in the funding, are there other ways that cohorts of individuals could put money together to advance a medicine development program? In the world of basic research, we've certainly seen how organized patients through advocacy have been able to advance key research initiatives, but we've also seen incredible democratization of so many breakthrough technologies and how DIY and do-it-yourself and the biohacking community is able to leverage the types of technologies that just a few short years ago might have been restricted to the purviews of elite academic centers, and today become almost communal property, enabling lots of individuals to start to run experiments, looking to see what types of discoveries could be made more widely available. Now, when we think about the ability to find people and to find patients, patient communities today, whether through social or in real life, have become such an important part of medicine development, and they'll only continue to stay that way. It's interesting for us to start to think about what happens when we data enable organize patients in communities and enable them to bring and share more of their own data together, so that those patients are no longer just sharing interesting and important stories and anecdotes and experiences, but are also able to share structured and rich and trusted electronic health data in the process. The types of places where patients are contributing to research, I think in meetings like patient-centered approach to clinical trials, we've been seeing for a number of years. Patient voice in the clinical research process is not new, and it's only getting more clear and more mature. But in parallel with that, the types of tools and platforms that were once isolated for elite and expensive processes are now increasingly democratized. When we look at what in the past might have required a big and expensive data infrastructure and licensing software, today there are studies that could be run using platforms like Apple's Research Kit or Android Study Kit, platforms that can enable almost anybody to design and build the tools on which to run a clinical research study. And so all of a sudden, these expensive processes and expensive tools are becoming increasingly available for even organized patients to design and lead their own studies. The ability for patients to bring their own real world data into clinical trials is becoming less and less a dream and a fantasy. And so futures where patients are really in the driver's seat of bringing and connecting data into research studies, connecting their electronic health records, connecting their sensor or other derived data, and then adding other types of patient reported data to the process. Again, we have examples in the ecosystem of where patients have been doing this on their own. One great example is when we look at the Patients Like Me community in ALS, that years ago, there was some early data that came out of a small study in Italy that suggested that lithium had positive effects on ALS outcomes. And while in one path, investigators started submitting grants, trying to write protocols to identify if lithium then worked for patients with ALS in a larger study, the patients in the Patients Like Me platform that were already connected with one another started to share structured data with one another through simple tools like Google Sheets and others. And through those tools, those patients were able to answer the question with a larger sample size that lithium did not help drive improved outcomes in patients with ALS, and that patient-generated finding based on aggregating data on their own was generated long before a study was funded and protocols written for research investigators to come to that exact same conclusion. Finally, it's no secret that regulators today are increasingly trusting and relying on the voice of patients in the process of regulatory decision making. Patients have already earned that place as a trusted voice with regulatory authorities when they're looking to understand unmet need around a particular indication, or for patient voice when considering the data and evidence that's being generated and represented coming back as a part of the submission process. And so my message here is twofold. One, it's amazing to see the ways that organized patients are already impacting each step in the drug development process. For many of us, we might have seen these examples in silos emerging in one corner or another. But the second level that's exciting is then to see, just as a biopharmaceutical company has mastered the ability to integrate across these silos, I believe there are very real futures where organized patients will be in exactly that same position. And so setting up that next disruptor for clinical trials as with today will likely not be Silicon Valley or just a technology company. It's more likely that it will come from the stakeholder that is already mastering this process in one silo after the other. And as they build up the competency to integrate across, it will be the organized patients themselves who are best in that position. I like to remind my friends in pharma, and they are working hard to do right by patients and stakeholders today, that leading in medicine development today, that inviting others to that table is not a right, it's a privilege. And if the time comes when they're not able to lead that table with the appropriate sense of urgency relative to others, then it is the right time to step aside, because the next disruptor of clinical trials is very likely to be you, the patients themselves, in particular, as patients continue to organize and own each of those steps in the process and start to look laterally and realize how many steps in the process they already own and how they themselves can be the next integrated leader in clinical research and medicine development. I'm going to leave you there. It's really been a pleasure to share what some of these futures may look like in the clinical research space. I'm looking forward to seeing the talks that remain here around patient-centered approaches to clinical trials. If you have questions about this content, my connection there on Twitter is at Craig Lipset, and I'm always happy to hear from you on social. Thanks again for the opportunity to share with you here today.
Craig, I want to thank you so much for a disruptive presentation. It strikes me that there's a lot of what I call consumerism starting to happen around a concept of consumerisms are being applied to clinical trials in many, many ways. I like the table analogy because I think it offers you some very simplistic questions to be able to ask as one goes through a process. Whose table is it? Who's doing the inviting? Is everybody equal at the table? What are the contributions of everybody? And those are very simple, basic questions to be able to structure a conversation around why patients, in fact, are the disruptor. So thank you so much for an incredible presentation. I want to reinforce, can you give us your Twitter handle again, please? I know there's people going to have questions. Please say that again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
On Twitter, it's just my name at Craig Lipset, or I'm also always available on LinkedIn as well, and always happy to hear others' thoughts, ideas, and questions around this topic.
Yeah, and to our audience, Colorectal Cancer Canada will be very happy to connect you into Craig if you have further questions as well. Thank you again, Craig, for joining us today. We very much appreciate your time and for your inspiring remarks.
Thank you all.